This is the comics alternative for young readers. Reviews of 3x4, The Creepy Case Files of Margo Maloo, The Monster Mall, and Sheets.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Gwen.
And I'm Krystal, and we're two PhDs talking about comics for young readers.
On this episode of the Comics Alternative's Young Readers Show, we'll be discussing three new releases. The first is Ivan Brunetti's 3x4, which was published last month by Toon Books and is geared towards early elementary readers. Next, we'll be talking about Drew Wing's middle grade novel, The Creepy Case Files of Margo Maloo, The Monster Mall, which is the second in the Margo Maloo series, and it's from First Second Books. And to round out the show, we'll be discussing Brenna Thumler's debut graphic novel for middle grade and teen readers called Sheets, and this is put out by Lion Forge's Cubhouse imprint. I'm also excited to introduce our listeners to Dr. Krystal Howard. She's an assistant professor in the liberal studies and English departments at California State University, Northridge, and she will be taking over Paul Lai's co-hosting duties on the Young Readers Show. However, before we meet Krystal and say a fond farewell to Paul, I want to remind everyone that our program is sponsored by Discount Comic Book Service. Well, folks, head over to DCBS Service for all your comics pre-ordering needs. Every week, DCBS has DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles for 40% off. And many other publishers' comics regularly run between 20 and 35% off the list price. In fact, DCBS has specials that run 45 to 50% off the regular cover price, and often the discounts are more impressive than that. So head over to dcbservice.com or their sister site, InStock Trades, for all of your comics needs.
This month, Discount Comic Book Service has Brenna Thumler's Sheets for $9.09, which is 30% off the cover price, as well as the first volume in Drew Wing's Margo Maloo series for $11.19, again 30% off the cover price.
Which is a really great savings, and when you do order with DCB Service, be sure to tell them that Krystal and Gwen sent you. Regular listeners to the Young Readers Show will already know Krystal from her spot as a panelist last summer in a special roundtable that Paul Lai and I hosted on the future of children's and YA comics. I'm so pleased that you're joining us, Krystal, as a co-host. Why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
Well, I am also so pleased to be joining you on the Comics Alternative podcast for young readers. A longtime listener, so very excited. A little bit of background about me. I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, and I attended undergrad at Drake University. This is kind of where I got my first taste of my love for comics. In some young adult literature classes that I took. So we read things like Phoebe Gluckner's comics, and that's really where it all started. After I finished undergrad, I moved to Michigan to go to grad school at Western Michigan University, and I did my MFA in creative writing there, and also my PhD in literature, and that is where I met the fabulous and wonderful Gwen Tarbox.
Yes, that's right. We have known each other for a long time, actually, because I think you took a class with me in 2010.
Yes. Yes. So some intro to comics classes there. And like Gwen said, about a year ago, I moved to California to start a new gig as an assistant professor at California State University, Northridge. I teach children's literature, young adult literature, comics classes, and teacher prep courses for the liberal studies program in the English department here at CSUN. So again, super excited.
And Krystal, I know you do a lot of work in the schools now too with kids. And are you seeing a lot of comics in the classroom there, or are you bringing comics to the classroom?
Yes, actually, I'm bringing lots of comics to the classroom. So we're doing work at at a few different elementaries in the San Fernando Valley area. And I encourage my students my teacher prep students to bring those comics into the classroom. So for instance, this semester, they're bringing Secret Coders into the elementary classroom. And the coming semester, we're also bringing some more comics to another elementary school.
That's great. So, one of the things that's nice, and one of the reasons why I'm really excited that Krystal is joining us, is she does have that kind of engagement both with future teachers and then with students in the K through 12 classrooms through the prep work that she's doing on a lot of projects. And I know you have a really successful grant project going right now with work in elementary classrooms. So that's exciting to sort of have someone who is on another coast, and who's doing some things with actual children and actual comics. But, I do want our listeners to know how much we will miss Paul Lai. He is an incredible comics scholar and wonderful human being. He recently graduated with his doctorate from the School of Education in Language, Literacy, and Culture at the University of California, Berkeley. And he's just begun a new position as the director of UC Berkeley's prestigious B3 program, and that stands for Berkeley Educators for Equity and Excellence. And I can think of no one better suited for that job than Paul. He intends to return to the Comics Alternative family from time to time as a podcaster, and we want to wish him the very best in his new role. Paul has just been such a good friend, and he has a great perspective too because he has a young daughter, and oftentimes he would give us a sense for what she was thinking. And in the months to come, Krystal and I are going to begin doing more interviews for the Young Readers Show, and that will include talking to librarians on a regular basis and maybe having Paul on as a guest, but also trying to interview some kids as well and some teachers who are working with kids in comics. So we're going to try and really open up the microphone to a lot of people who are involved with children and comics, but just really want to say thank you to Paul Lai for 2 years of amazing service as a co-host on the Young Reader Show, and wish him the very best at Berkeley. Krystal, let's start things off by discussing our first text today, which is Ivan Brunetti's adorable and somewhat addictive Level 1 comic 3x4. As our listeners probably already know, Toon Books has engaged a former educational consultant, Kimberly Guise, as their marketing director, and she was instrumental in helping Toon to reach out to parents and educators with a handy guide to sharing comics with young readers. And part of that guide and part of the process that Toon goes through is to basically classify their comics along a scale from 1 to 3, with 1 being easy to read comics and 3 being much more complicated comics for young readers. And this book that we're going to be talking about today, 3x4, is a level 1 book. And easy to read comics include typically what they call 100 to 300 sight words, short sentences, a single time frame or theme, and 1 to 2 panels per page. And this book definitely conforms to that. And I will say that the concepts included, however, are quite complex. They're mathematical in nature. I think that any young reader and a good number of adults would find his text to be really a great read. The story begins in an elementary school classroom where a teacher gives his students an assignment telling them, quote, "For your homework, you'll draw 12 things, but in sets." And the children, who happen to be 12 in number, I don't know if you counted, Krystal, but I did, are actually sitting in sets themselves at little work tables. And thus begins what I would term the meta-numeral narrative, as each page of the comic includes lots of obvious as well as somewhat more hidden sets, making this book a book that children could pore over for a long time, at least very detail-oriented children. I'm one of those kind of people, so I really enjoyed sort of counting things on the pages. But the book includes speaking roles for most of the children, but the text is mainly focalized through Anna Marie, a young girl who was featured in Brunetti's first Toon book called Wordplay. In this volume, the attention turns away from words and on to numbers. So, Krystal, what did you think of 3x4?
I absolutely loved it. I thought it was as you said, quite adorable, and just really engaging. You don't really see a huge amount, or I don't usually encounter a huge amount of super early reader comics. So it was really great to see something like this for earlier readers. Mm-hmm. And definitely gave me a lot to think about in terms of how I would introduce it to future teachers as a way to use comics in the classroom. We're talking a lot about integrated teaching and using interdisciplinary approaches in the classroom, and I think this would be a really great book to use pedagogically. One other thing that I really loved about the comic was the diversity within it, right? Mm-hmm. So lots of different kinds of children and parents are depicted throughout the text, which is great. And the style is also really interesting. The curved lines, the interesting depiction of the children and adults in the text really stood out.
Yeah, these are definitely hipster parents. I'm just going to say it. Everyone is thinking it. They're definitely dressed in some pretty cool hipster outfits. One of my favorite scenes is this little boy has gone home to do his homework, and all the kids are trying to decide what subject matter they want for their sets. And he's decided to do hot dogs, pizza, and hamburgers. So he's drawn, and sandwiches. So he's drawn like 3 pizza slices, and he's drawn, 3 hot dogs, 3 sandwiches, and he comes up to his mom and he's like, "Mom, I'm hungry." And Mom is way cool. She's got a little hipster outfit on, and it's really adorable. But then if you look at the picture carefully, there's a picture on the wall of 3 sunflowers. There are 3 notes on the refrigerator. There are 3 bananas in a fruit bowl, and the cat is sitting in front of 3 cat dishes. And I mean, you could even get more meta than that. There are 3 little pieces of stray cat food on the mat. That's what I meant when I said that you could start to get obsessive about sets, looking at this. The only thing that could be different is there's a clock and it looks like it's 7 o'clock, but it would be really cool if it were 3 o'clock. But at any rate, the point is that there are sets on every single page. And it is cute, too, just not only seeing what the kids decide will be the subject matter, but like you said, sort of looking at the different parents and what they're doing and how they interact with their kids. Anne Marie's dad, for instance, is obsessed with her doing cars. So he's telling her about all the different kinds of cars. And the next day when he's taking her to school, he starts up again with other kinds of cars. And she's all like, "Dad, I'm so sure. I'm done with that assignment." So it's pretty cute in that respect. But, you said you were bringing secret coders into the classroom. This might be a good book to teach before it.
Absolutely. That is exactly what I was thinking. And I was particularly lingering on the spread that shows one of the students in the classroom saying, "Mine is the best." And it shows him using graph paper. We see a computer in the background. He has a microscope. So his bedroom is really interesting here. But then on the facing page, we actually see a close-up of his graph paper drawing where he's drawn 3 animals, 3 families, 3 houses, and 3 trees all in one scene. Mm-hmm. So yeah, again, it was really interesting to see the different interpretations of this assignment for all of the children, the child characters in the comic.
And it also reinforces the number of ways that you can get to 12. So one little boy points to the refrigerator and he says, "Oh, he's looking at a carton of eggs," right? And he's like, "As long as it's 12. So if you read this comic carefully, and this is the sort of comic that I think kids would want read over and over again, and they'd want to point things out. You really get the principle of sets by the time it's over. Even a math troglodyte like myself could figure out that there was some important stuff going on here. And creativity is also something that is underscored here. And in that respect, this reminds me a lot of Andrea Beatty's series that she's done that also is sort of STEM related. I don't know if you've looked at her books, but she does Ada
Yes.
Twist, scientist, and
Rosie Revere, engineer,
and Iggy Peck, architect, and
yes.
I think that this Brunetti's text is sort of taking place at a time when a lot of people are using picture books and comics to encourage young people to become interested in math and science, and this is just yet another book that is doing the same thing. And I guess the other thing I'll say is that just the aesthetics are beautiful. The color is beautiful. This is the sort of book that you could easily see a kid returning to again and again. So even though it's a really simple concept, the different kids and their choices and the way that things are drawn either on graph paper or, as you were saying, the kid who's just like got all the tools and gizmos, but even kids who just have a very simple home life, you can tell they've taken to this assignment and are really enjoying it.
Yes, and I particularly love the end where we're kind of seeing all of the students' ideas come together, right? So we see the wall where they're all pasted up, and it's kind of a nice review in a way too, that it's being underscored there. So they're very fun.
Well, Brunetti is both a comics creator, but he's also an art instructor. And that makes him, I think, really well suited to write this volume. Older listeners might want to check out his book called Cartooning, Philosophy and Practice, which came out in 2011 from Yale University Press. And what's really interesting about this is in interviews about 3x4, Brunetti said that he gives his own students, his college students, the same assignment, except that he makes them draw 25 sets rather than just out of 12. And so in a way, this also could serve as a modeling exercise for kids who want to learn to drawing sets of things. And so it's a practice that I'm sure Brunetti is, very conscious of encouraging young people to take up or take part in.
Yes, and I love there's a little blurb in the about the author section at the end where Brunetti says, seeing the world as groups of numbers helps me make sense of things, and it never gets old because math has so many mysteries, which I think is just lovely.
Yeah, and math does have many, many mysteries, as we know. But again, it sort of links it to Secret Coders, which for those of our listeners who haven't yet encountered Mike Holmes and Jean Luen Yang's series, it helps young children, mainly maybe third grade and up, understand coding through mysteries. And so it's really great. I wish that these books had existed when I was a kid, because I think I would have been much better at math and science, or at least I would have enjoyed them more. So.
Yeah, really bringing together like the love of the visual with math, which is great.
Absolutely. Well, Krystal, moving on to our second release, let's take a look at Drew Wing's second volume in the Margo Maloo series, which is called The Monster Mall. Margo Maloo began in 2014 as a webcomic, and it features Charles Thompson, who's a young white kid from the suburbs who reluctantly follows his parents into an urban area where they are engaged in rehabilitating a former hotel. And although Mr. and Mrs. Thompson appear to be very progressive and thoughtful about the impact of gentrification, Charles himself has nonetheless accumulated a strong set of fears around city living, and given that he and his family are white and the majority of their neighbors are not, this text enters into an interesting dialogue about what it means to be afraid, especially of people whom one might simply have never encountered. For as it turns out, Charles does have something very much in common with the other kids in his new neighborhood. They're all afraid of monsters. They've all seen monsters. Monsters appear to be lurking everywhere, from Charles' new apartment building to highway underpasses to sewers and other hidden spaces. Charles wants to be an investigative reporter, and this is what compels him, despite his fears, to follow Margo Maloo on a series of increasingly intense cases. Now, Margo is a young woman who has had a talent for mediation her whole life. And she uses this to build bridges between the human world and the world of monsters. And it's clear here that the monsters are constantly being rooted from their homes by human beings bent on gentrification, right? In fact, the entire series to date focuses on how monsters are being displaced from their homes and even separated from their children, all in the name of progress. Krystal, why don't you describe a little bit about this particular volume, The Monster Mall?
Yeah, so this comic begins in Charles' bedroom, and he's hanging out with his friend Kevin. This is so interesting to me because I decided that I wasn't going to start off with the first volume, that I was going to start here to see if to see how we could recommend this to readers as a standalone text. So when we start off here, he's in his bedroom with Kevin. It's kind of a slow start, but then we learn about Margo Maloo, and Charles begins his trek over to her place. Once we get over to her place, I think things get really interesting for our readers. And the color palette certainly changes in some really interesting ways. I like the shift from the lights to the more shadowed perspective that we get as Charles kind of enters into Margo's office. And that was one of my favorite pages in the comic, that spread 20 to 21, where we see Charles wandering up the steps into Margo's office, which is kind of like a great little hoarder's paradise here. So that's great. And then they start off on, again, like you said, their journey through the neighborhood to kind of try to protect various groups of monsters from the humans that are really taking over places where they've called their home or where they've been spending a lot of their time. So we see a few different instances of that, which is interesting.
Right. And, did you then go back and read the first volume, or have you just read this one?
I've just read this one so far.
But you were able to follow it pretty well.
Absolutely. I would say I was a little bit nervous at first because you kind of start like in the middle of things. But once you get about four or five pages in, it really gets easy to understand what's happening here. And actually, it really made me want to go back to the first one and also to see where the series goes from here.
Yeah, because it's interesting. They are case files, so the interactions that Margo and Charles have with monsters, they're usually set off into individual chapters, and so this book starts with chapter 4. So basically the first book has 3 chapters, and it's sort of, you get introduced to Charles and his personality, and you sort of see how he learns that maybe it's important in life to be a good listener, especially as someone who wants to be a reporter. And so basically, just to give our readers a sense for one of the stories, in one instance, a family has moved from the city into a more suburban ring of the city. And one of the features of this book is that on the fly cover, you get a picture of the subway system for Echo City, which is the city that Drew Wing has created for this story. It looks a lot like Manhattan, and I think you're supposed to sort of think about it that way. But as you follow the adventures in this particular volume, Charles is learning how to use the subway, and so you can sort of see how he gets around and how he and Margo end up sort of being in different parts of town and what those parts of town might mean. But in this first episode, there's this little imp who has been separated from his family. They had lived in the attic of, I believe it's Ty and Tay's home. And when their family moves out to the suburbs, one little imp is separated from his imp family when the kids go up in the attic and start tearing boxes apart and that sort of thing. And part of what Margo tries to do throughout the course of the book is to reunite this little imp with his parents, because when Charles and Margo go back with the imp to the old house, that old house is gone. It's been obliterated, and in its place is going to be a bright, shiny new condo building. And that's really where the sadness sets in for this little imp, because he doesn't know where his family goes. Well, we learn from some of Margo's monster underworld contacts that the imp family is searching for this little impy child. And so, but actually by the end of this volume, the imp has not yet returned to his family. And so it's clear that, this text isn't always about tying up loose ends. And it really serves as a commentary on some of the negative effects of gentrification, or at least I think it's asking young readers to recognize that just because something is shiny and new, there are stories that have been cast aside so that a lot can be torn down and a big apartment building can come in. And so, it's interesting how Wing, throughout this entire text is asking readers or asking young kids really to think about the effects of what we would call progress. And he really calls into question, I think, the way that, families can be devastated when moneyed interests come into their neighborhood and start tearing buildings down and really ripping families and neighborhoods apart. So there's a definite social justice message here, I think.
Absolutely. And then in the second half of this volume, that's chapter 5, and it's entitled "The Kids in the Mall," we kind of see, this is my favorite section of the collection here. We kind of see this group of teenagers who's a little bit obsessed with ghosts and monsters, and they're kind of like a little emo band of teens. They go into the mall where, they hope to see some monsters, but Margo has consulted with the group of teen vampires that's living there. And we kind of see that interaction between these teens with all of their cell phones out, hoping to see some monsters and the actual teen vampires that are living in this mall, which is kind of fun. So we kind of see both sides of that, the child side and the teen side in this
and what's really interesting is, I think you're supposed to feel that Margo and Charles are sort of middle grade. And it's always interesting the way that kids who are in, say, 6th, 7th, or 8th grade are still in that place where they view teenagers as being almost adults. And you can see that both Charles and Margo look at all of these teenagers who are having these interactions, and they're kind of rolling their eyes like, these crazy teens, why won't they get it together or whatever. So there's a lot of interesting, you're right, age dynamics going on. And I would say that, this is for readers of the first volume, the group of kids that Krystal's describing are the ones who were locked into the old Echo newspaper company. And that's the first time that Charles and Margo meet them. And so it's really cute the way that a lot of the characters are reappearing too.
Yeah. And along that note that you made about like the social justice feature of the text, I mean, we also see that in this section when we learn that these teen vampires are vegan because they're realizing that their parents, their mom and dad vampires, drank a lot of blood and they never wanted to do the same thing. So we have kind of along that lines an eco focus here with the vampires, which is kind of great.
Yeah, it is. There's a lot to love about this volume. And, I know many of our listeners love Drew Wing, and there's a reason for that. He's really got a great sense of humor. And this is another action-packed volume that I think both sort of, late elementary through even teens would probably really like this book, because there's a lot of funny sort of nods, as you point out, Krystal, to popular culture. And I think kids would like it a lot.
Yes. And, along the same line, too, you were mentioning the Echo City Transit Authority system that's kind of in the front and back of the book. Just the entire paratext of this book is really interesting. There's a little case file in the back, which gives you like these handwritten on case files describing different monsters. So we have the imp, We have vampires, and we have lots of typed in description that apparently, seems to have come from Margo's relative, right, who was dealing with these files before, and then she has her handwritten notes in there, so that's kind of fun.
Yeah, and Margo still remains something of a mystery. We learn more about her because, as you say, Charles visits her house, but it's really clear that that Margo is in many respects just still a mystery to readers, but we now at least know where she lives, what the house looks like. It's appropriately creepy. There's this great scene of Charles standing in front of it, and he said, would it be anything other than this? Because it's just this, it has this very Gothic look to it. And so I thought that was pretty charming.
Yes, and do we meet her uncle Vikram in this volume for the first time, or is he in the previous volume as well?
This is the first time we meet him because this is the first time that Charles has gone to Margo's house. So we know that she's spoken to him. And, it can also get a little bit confusing because this is a webcomic as well.
Yes,
and so sometimes I have to admit, Krystal, I will look ahead and I will look at the webcomic and I get a little bit confused about like order or whatever. But this is really the first time that we see the interior at length. In the past, we see Margo go home in the first book, and we see her sort of alone, but we don't really know what her family situation is.
Well, she certainly is the character that I was most interested in. So I think that would also really carry young readers along throughout the series as more volumes and strips come out.
Absolutely. Well, Krista, we're finishing up our show today with a fascinating and beautiful comic by newcomer Brenna Thumler. Her text Sheets is out by Lion Forge's Cub House imprint. And for our readers who may be somewhat new to children's and young adult comics, Lion Forge is a pretty relatively new comics corporation that's been set up to particularly focus on diversity and inclusion in children's and young adult comics. And their Cub House imprint is meant basically for a middle grade readership, although I would argue that Sheets could easily be classified as young adult and, on the sort of more early young adult end of things. On her website, Thumler describes herself in this way. She says, quote, I grew up in the piney hills of Pennsylvania, where I developed a deep love for hiking trails, peanut butter, and ghost stories. After receiving my BFA from Ringling College of Art and Design in 2015, I relocated to Kansas City. Midwestern peanut butter appeared to be the same, but I still decided to return to the place I call home and focus on ghost stories of my own. And so, this particular story, Sheets, it references both the laundromat where the protagonist Marjorie works, but it also references the ghost whom she meets, who is drawn just like the way kids draw ghosts, right? With a sheet, basically. The text is set in a lakeside resort community where there is a definite economic divide between wealthy residents who reside in beachfront mansions and service workers like the protagonist Marjorie Glatt, who runs her family's laundromat in the wake of her mother's accidental death by drowning. In this way, by the way, I would just interject that this reminds me in some ways of that same kind of divide that happens in the Tamaki's This One Summer, a wonderful graphic novel from a few years ago that maybe many of our listeners are familiar with. Marjorie's father in this text has fallen into a deep depression and remains in his bedroom, while her 5-year-old brother seems cast adrift, trying to figure out where his happy family life has gone. A further conflict emerges as the town's lazy trust fund guy, this creepy man called Mr. Saubertuck, tries to steal away Marjorie's business so that he can develop a yoga retreat on what is prime lakefront real estate downtown where the laundromat is at. Ultimately, in a fascinating twist, Marjorie is aided by the ghost of an 11-year-old boy, Wendell, who whooshes into the laundry, first causing chaos, but ultimately helping to bring resolution to Marjorie's troubles. So this is a pretty amazing debut by Thumler. Krystal, what did you think?
I absolutely loved this comic. You know, one of my favorite comics is Anya's Ghost by Vera Brosgol, and this had so many really interesting connections to that. I really love the way that Thumler uses, really kind of tough topics like death, depression, and grief, but also juxtaposes that with this kind of dark humor of the ghosts, right? The first time that we encounter Wendell, it's to see him in this support group called DYE, D-Y-E, Dead Youth Empathetics, which is hilarious, right? One thing that really struck me the most about this comic was the use of color throughout. There are shifts in the comic in the way that color is used. When we first meet Marjorie, one of my favorite early spreads is on page 8 and 9, and that's where we see Marjorie walking along the city street in front of Glatt's Laundry, her family business. And she's relatively small on the page, but the scenery around her is really infused with lots of deep purples and pinks, very bubblegummy kind of. And then we see this blue background, right? And the only narrative on this spread is sometimes I feel even less visible than that. And it's kind of hidden in the background, kind of in the waterscape. So that was just like some really beautiful visual imagery that stuck out to me right away. And then when we shift into Wendell's perspective, we really have this gray-green kind of color palette at work. And even some more darker purples. He has Wendell as the ghost character is, as you said, is causing a lot of chaos here. But he even is creating some imaginative stories later on in the comic as we get about 100 pages in. So there's another interesting color palette shift there. But the colors in this comic really stood out to me so much.
And I would also say just the way that people are drawn, they're drawn with their imperfections. One of the things that I've noticed about a lot of YA comics that feature a young girl as a protagonist is that there's a tendency to sort of create almost an idealized portrait of girlhood, whereas Marjorie looks like really an average teenager. I actually really believe that she is who she is in this text, and there's just some really lovely scenes towards the middle of the book where Marjorie is talking to her swim coach. And, teens at this age are very self-conscious about their bodies typically. And the way that Marjorie is sort of holding herself, you can just see the way that she's drawn that she feels a lot of, a self-consciousness, a lot of anxiety. She's uncomfortable in the conversation that they're having. And that is conveyed so much more by the figural placement than it is even by what the characters are saying to each other. In fact, there are many wordless panels in this interchange where you can really see like Marjorie feeling uncomfortable and sad, and it comes through beautifully without words. So, I'd almost, in some ways, this is like an extremely colorful Tilly Walden comic. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She came out with Spinning last year, but she's been she's been doing a lot of independent comics since she was in art school, and this has sort of a feeling of that. But I think that Thumler is she's really at this point, very mature artist, even though she's quite young. And she does, like you say, a good job of using color to convey emotion and figural placement and text placement to really allow you to feel Marjorie's sense of isolation, even though this is not just a downer book. I mean, there's a lot of
humor. Yeah,
that you mentioned. And I would also say that, some of the storyline to me seemed a little forced, And by that, I mean that I'm not entirely sure how realistic the character of Mr. Sauerbach would be. Not that he's not drawn realistically, but some of the things that happen in the plot seem a little like they might not happen in real life. I mean, Marjorie's given a lot of authority over family decision making. That does happen in some families, but it felt a little off just a tiny bit. But for the most part, as a debut comic, I thought this was really just a beautiful evocation of a young person trying to pull it together after a terrible loss and trying to keep her family together. And, it also really cuts a lot into those class issues between people who live in a resort town and the people who visit it or who profit from it. And, that I found to be really, really interesting.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, Gwen. This Mr. Sabertuck character seemed so strange to me. I could definitely tell he was there for a bit of comedy, but some of the plot line where he's, where we see him plotting, and he's really like the villain of this text. It did seem kind of strange to me. I often wondered, what is this guy doing? So that was a bit strange, but I, again, will underscore that exactly like you were saying, just the way that Marjorie is drawn as a character, even like her face was something that really stuck out to me. The way that her face is drawn is very expressive. She often has this expression of sadness, of a kind of anxiety on her face, which was very moving and really added to the impact of the comic, I think.
And, but for a comic that is set in our real world, but that includes ghosts that are drawn in such a, stereotypical way. I mean, literally like the way kids would draw ghosts. Actually, all those ghosts start to have individual personalities too. And you start to see the difference between how they hold themselves or how they interact with humans. And so, I mean, there's a lot of improbability in this text, and yet somehow it feels extremely real. And I think that's a testament to Brenna Thumler's skill as a storyteller.
Absolutely. I would have to say that the ghost scenes, when we switch from Marjorie's perspective to kind of the ghost perspective, those were some of the most delightful scenes in this work, and actually very believable. I was definitely able to suspend my disbelief and enter into the ghost world and go to their support group along with Wendell. And it was lovely, yes.
Well, the last two books that we've talked about today are very fitting. This is the October Young Readers Show, and, monsters and ghosts are, sort of the staple for this time of year. And I would say, though, that in both instances, both Wing and Thumler are using sort of common tropes or even stereotypical ideas about monsters and ghosts and turning those upside down and really creating comics that make you think. And make you really try to, especially I think for young readers, to try to understand the way that adults make decisions and how sometimes those decisions actually have a hugely negative impact, and how kids are slowly coming to that realization, and that's part of growing up, is to realizing that the adults in your life are not perfect. And I think both of these books do a good job with that.
Yes, absolutely. I love the little kind of like Halloween October theme that we have working through these books that you've picked for us to look at. And certainly I think that the Margo Maloo book and the Sheets book are both doing really interesting things with class and pairing those ideas really nicely with these common kind of monster or ghost narratives.
Geez, Krystal, we have had a jam-packed first episode. I think we've been able to put together some really neat reads for our listeners, and it's just been such a pleasure to do this show with you. Our first episode together, and the first of many, I certainly hope. So.
Yes, so fun. I had so much fun reading these books and chatting with you about them this week. Hopefully our listeners will also pick up these books.
Absolutely. Well, we want to remind folks to visit our sponsors, DCB Service and their sister company, In Stock Trades, where you're going to find lots of amazing comics priced anywhere from 20 to 50% off of list price. And after you do get your comics there and sit back with your little mini Halloween candies to read, get in touch with us to let us know what you think of the books. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com. And on the right-hand side of your browser, you should see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. If you click on that, from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or if you want to contact us the old school way, you can call us on the telephone at 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. Or you can contact us by email at 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. And Krystal, how can people reach you?
Listeners can reach me at Krystal at comicsalternative.com. You can also find us on Twitter, where we announce our new content to our podcast and updates on our blog. We are at the number 2, Guys with PhDs. We're also on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, and Pinterest, so all of the social medias. We even have a YouTube channel, so you can access us that way. We are everywhere. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher, and you can find us on TuneIn and also on Spotify. So again, everywhere on the internets.
I'd love it if listeners would try and contact us on all those devices simultaneously. That would be exciting. You can also discover every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary, on our blog at comicsalternative.com. So until next time, I'm Gwen.
And I'm Krystal.
See you soon.